May we pray. Lord, once again, we ask that you open our hearts and minds by the power of your Spirit, so that as these scriptures are read and your word proclaimed, we may indeed hear with joy what you say to us this day. For we ask it in your Son's name. Amen. There's one of those little Johnny stories I'd like to share with you this morning. Little Johnny was walking with his mom and dad after worship back to the car. And his mother asked, "Johnny, what did you learn in Sunday school?" And little Johnny said, "Oh, it was great. It was a great story about Moses." And Mommy said, well, tell me the story of Moses." And he said, "Mommy, Moses faced down this galactic emperor. And this emperor had the Revolutionary Guard in captivity. And Moses went and he tossed his rod down and it turned into a lightsaber. And he warned this galactic emperor that if he didn't do what he said, that there was going to be all kinds of creative weapons unleashed upon him. So the emperor let the rebel alliance go. And on their way, they came to this river, and Moses took out his laser beam and parted the sea, and they all went across the river dry. And his mother stopped him just a second and said, "Johnny, is that true? Is that what you were told in Sunday school?" He said, "But Mommy, if you'd have heard what they'd have told, you would have never believed it." "In a time of universal deceit," said George Orwell many years ago. In a time of universal deceit, telling the truth is a revolutionary act. What is truth? What is truth? What a great question to ask this postmodern world. But it's really not a postmodern question. It's a question that goes all the way back to our primordial parents there in that beautiful garden, when that shadowy figure had them believe the lie, that God had not given them everything and they could rebel against God without death. What do these things hold in common? A choice cut of beef taken from the upper hind quarter of a cow is called sirloin because a king that was so pleased with his steak knighted it sirloin. Drinking Coca-Cola and eating Mentos killed several Brazilian children. When Germans ordered the Jews to wear a Star of David on their shoulder in occupied Denmark, a Christian king thwarted that order by wearing one too. Thanksgiving Day is the biggest shopping day of the year in the U.S. The word golf is an acronym that stands for gentlemen only, ladies forbidden. Albert Einstein said the most powerful force in this universe is compound interest. The FBI claims caches of UPS uniforms were stolen by terrorists to disguise themselves in neighborhoods in the United States. Gilligan's Island had a darker side to it. The island represented hell. No one wanted to be there, yet no one could leave. Each one of the characters represented one of the deadly sins. Ginger, of course, was lust, Mary Ann, envy, the professor, pride, Mr. Howell, greed, Mrs. Howell, slothfulness. Being big man and a skipper, he had two, gluttony and anger, because he always ate more than anybody else, and there wasn't an episode where he didn't hit Gilligan. And that leaves Gilligan. He put them there one way or another and keeps them there by foiling any escape plot. And the name implies it's his island, and he wore red every episode. So Gilligan is Lucifer. Nostradamus predicted 9/11. What do all those things hold in common? None of them are true. Not one of them. But every one of them has been passed along through years, either in magazines or papers or on the internet, as being valid, as being true. But none of them are. But people hear them, and they believe them, and they pass them along as being true. Truth today is getting harder and harder to find and discover. It's harder for truth today than back in Gilligan's day. It's certainly harder than the first century. What is truth? What is true? CNN has its version. Fox has its. Time magazine has its version, as U.S. News and World Report has its. The New York Times has its version of the truth, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has its version of the truth as well. The young have their version. The older and the more experienced have theirs. So, what's true? Wall Street measure it by stock prices. Gross national product, employment, the debt-equity ratio. Some judge it by form and function. If it looks good and it functions, then it must be true. There is so much information out there that is diametrically opposed from the other, and neither can be, both cannot be true. Yet both oftentimes is accepted as truth. And it makes me want to throw up my hands in disgust sometimes. We have morphed into a lazy intellectual age that believes whatever someone may think. And it gets easier today because whatever someone thinks, they get on the internet and they create these blogs and they start dumping their feelings and their emotions and what they think to be true on the internet. And people read that, and because it's on the internet, it must be true. Sometimes just at the post office, or in the beauty parlor, or at the barber shop, or in Sunday school. It might be all that's needed to pass along an untruth. Sadly, we don't examine or research on our own. Oh, we might Google it. We might even get on Wikipedia, that nebulous, always changing dictionary on the internet. But we don't spend any time or effort trying to find out what is really true. If we like the way it sounds and it's what we already believe, we're going to accept what we hear as being true. For instance, remember when Dan Brown wrote that novel, The Da Vinci Code? Remember that? He wrote many of them, and both of them are equally entertaining, but equally untruthful. And it didn't become apparent until the movie came out of all the mistakes that Dan Brown made in his novel. I mean, he couldn't even get the geography right. He had towns in southern Paris, France, and northern France. He had places in Paris turned around. And that's not even talking about the theology, which was terrible. It was entertaining, but it wasn't true. Yet, there was a woman leaving a theater in Columbia the night it aired. And she said as she walked out the door, "I'll never read the Bible again or go to another church." She accepted everything she heard and saw on that screen because it was on the screen as being true. Yes, the internet makes it worse. And today there's even news blogs on the internet with the intention of putting out false news reports. And people buy into it, and the next thing you see it's on Facebook. And people are sharing it, and it just goes on and on and on. But nobody looked to see if it was true to begin with. And we see it in the presidential candidates, from the Democrats and the Republicans. There are people out there assassinating their character with information that's just not true. But we believe it because we read it on the internet. Then, of course, there are those conspiracy theorists who have gone from President Kennedy being killed by cosmic aliens to the United States got blown up by the United States. I mean, the World Trade Center got blown up by the United States because we had debt we were trying to cover up, and we actually blew up the space shuttles because we were trying to hide scientific information. And there's people who believe that. Now, I'm not surprised that people write that stuff. But what really fascinates me and makes me sad is that we have intelligent people who read that and believe it, and then pass it on as being true. Dr. Clarence Bass, professor emeritus at Bethel Theological Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota, and a very good preacher, tells a story about preaching one time in California. And after the service was over, he thought he had done a very good job. And after the service was over, he was standing at the door, and people were lined up congratulating him and thanking him for the sermon. And there's this one little fella that came up to him and said, "Dr. Bass, you didn't preach loud enough." And he thanked him. And the little fellow came around and got back in line. And he came back up to Dr. Bass. He said, "Dr. Bass, you used too many big words." Then he went around and got back in line. And he got back up to Dr. Bass and he said, "You preached too long." And he went around, and this time instead of getting in line, he went over to the side, and Dr. Bass saw him talking to a group of people. So he pulled the minister over and asked him, he said, "Tell me about this little fellow over here that keeps going through the line." And the preacher said, "Oh, don't worry about him. He just repeats what everybody else says." Sometimes people make things up. I think sometimes they're just bored. Just bored. They're bored with life, and they need a little entertainment, so they create the entertainment. Or there is just a deep, dark pit in their soul, and they don't know how to fill it. So they fill it with false information. But you know what's sad? That deceit, that false truths, the lies, they would just die on the vine if we weren't ready to hear them. But we're ready to hear, and we'll listen to it, and then we will repeat it. And so the grape becomes a cluster of grapes. But if we would just not listen to it, it would shrink and die right there. Now, sadly, the church historically has been just as guilty of creating its own reality and passing around untruths as any in the secular world. Just ask Martin Luther. Ask some of the other forefathers of the Protestant Reformation. We can create it. Sometimes we'll frame it in theology, but it really becomes demonic and evil when it's sympathetic love and sympathetic grace, and then it's used to give deceitful credibility. Now, I've been around almost 40 years in active ministry, and I felt the sting of rumor and innuendo and half-truths and falsehoods. I've had people sit right in front of me and tell me things I knew were completely false about me and other people. And I think few pastors have been spared this problem. And I think it's one of the reasons why if you have 10 ministers that come into the ministry at the same time, only one will be in the ministry at retirement time. 1 out of 10 will actually retire a minister. 10 out of 100, in other words. Now, I'll give you a case in point. And this was kind of sort of funny, but there have been times where it hasn't been so funny. Gail and I went to a particular church, and in a conversation with Gail, And there were people standing around, and I said, and Gail and I, we have this playful side to each other, and I said, guess what your daughter did today? Sounds innocent enough, doesn't it? Now, when the kids did something bad or wrong, they were always her kids. You know, your son, your daughter. But a church member heard that. And by the time I got to the first staff parish relations committee, I had been divorced 3 times and remarried. Yeah. Because someone in that group heard me say, your child. So therefore, that was Gail's child, and we had been remarried. That was number 1. But by the time we got to the SPRC, it was 3 times. So it had to be told and retold and retold, and people just kept adding divorces and other children. Abraham Lincoln understood how illusion and falsehood can be dressed as truth. He was in a trial one time, and this one fella didn't believe what he was saying. And so Lincoln asked him a question. He said, if we had a cow in here, how many legs would that cow have? And the fellow said, well, 4, of course. And Lincoln said, okay, what if we said the tail of the cow is now a leg? How many legs would that cow have? And the fellow said, 5. And Lincoln said, see, that's where you're wrong. Just calling a tail a leg doesn't make it so. The cow still has only 4 legs. Now, you've heard me say this before, but I'll repeat it again. I wish, in addition to church membership, we added asked the members to submit themselves to the loyalty oath of the 4-way test of a Rotarian. Do y'all know what that is? Anybody here, raise your hand if you know what a Rotarian 4-way test is. Okay. I'm going to share it. First one, is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Sometimes I'm deeply afraid that if we as Christians use the 4-way test on ourselves before we said something, many of us wouldn't have much to say. But the Bible's clear. It's very clear about deceit and lying and the evil and the transgression of the lip and how God feels about it. But people keep doing it. They use it as entertainment, and they act as though God doesn't hear it, that God doesn't see it. Wow. Wow, listen to what Proverbs says. An evildoer listens to wicked lips, and a liar gives heed to a mischievous tongue. To me, it sounds like God doesn't care much for deceit. Now, the New Testament word for truth is aletheia. And it's a simple word. And both Pilate and Jesus use that word in this text this morning. Aletheia means unhidden. You see, truth is not hidden. It doesn't have any layers. It's transparent. It's open. It's on the table. It's in front of us all. Truth is exposed. It doesn't need to be dressed up. It's out there. It's only when we lie and we bring in the deceit does the layers start showing up. Aletheia is unhidden. Now remember that and think about this. There they were standing in a courtroom, if you will. They are from opposite ends of the cosmic order. Pilate is from that physical world. He represented wealth and power and control. He represented world dominion with the point of a sword. His reality was created by Rome, and he followed that reality to the point. A reality that would allow an emperor to call himself a god and demand that everybody worship him, and they did. It's an empire built on death and destruction at the point of the sword, but yet they could say, Roman peace. We're bringing Roman peace to the world. Pilate doesn't understand that he is merely a pawn and a counterfeit and a deceit-filled reality. He is both victim and victimizer. And it chills me to know that Pilate had Jesus' ultimate truth. Jesus' ultimate truth. He had ultimate truth standing right in front of him that day. And Pilate couldn't recognize it. Pilate couldn't see it. It's sort of like my keys. They could be right in front of me, and I do this. Gail, where's my keys? And she reaches in and says, here they are. Here they are. Pilate could not see the truth that was right in front of him. But isn't that what happens to us when we fill our reality with darkness, with that which is not true, that which is deceitful? We get to the point where we can't see the truth any longer. I think we asked a similar question today. What's truth? There are so many half-truths and deceits and outright fabrications that we have, like Pilate, become cynical about truth. Cynicism permeates the fabric of our society today. Listen to our government. It's even in Washington, D.C. It's in our institutions. It saturates our souls. Even churches have become sarcastic and pessimistic, and they have allowed the negativity to infiltrate the sinews of the church. Churches that are supposed to be the hope and bearers of the good news of Jesus Christ instead become the conveyors of darkness and negativity. We are both the victim and the victimizer, the lied to and the liar. The untruths have been so convenient and so effective that we no longer desire to learn the truth and are happy with the untruth. How do we find the truth? Well, the truth is in Jesus. He said it that day in Pilate's courtroom. Jesus is the truth. We find Jesus beneath the frenzy of life. We find him in the sharing of love, in the giving of grace, in the generous open hand of forgiveness. We find him when we let go of the complicated and demanding and turn our souls over to humility and love. We'll find him when the important things in life are not prestige or power or control or my way over your way or the material comforts in this world, but in love and peace and charity and harmony. What is truth? What is truth? That was the original question, and it's our question too. Do we really want to know? Do we really want to know? And I'm reminded of that movie. I love the movie, A Few Good Men. I love that movie when Lieutenant Kendrick demands the truth from Colonel Jessup. They're in the courtroom, and Colonel Jessup, out of anger, he says, "You can't handle the truth." Can we? Can we handle the truth about ourselves? Can we handle the truth? Some of you may remember Rosalie Elliott. She was a spelling bee champion from Central South Carolina back in 1966. Anybody here remember her? Okay. Well, she went to Washington, D.C. in the spelling bee, 11 years old, and she was asked to spell the word avowal. And in her slow southern drawl, the judges couldn't figure out if she said an A or an E. So they argued among themselves about whether it was an A or an E, and they still couldn't decide. So they listened to the audio. Each one of them listened over and over and over to the audio, and they still could not make it out. So they turned to the only one who really knew the answer, Rosalie. Rosalie, did you say an A or an E? And without hesitation, Rosalie said an E, which was a misspelling. And she thanked him immediately and turned and walked off stage. The judges and the audience and even the contestants knew what had just taken place. And they cried and they applauded this 11-year-old girl as she walked off stage in truth. Paul Tillich, a Prussian-born theologian, said, "Very early the church forgot the word of our gospel, that he is the truth." Christians forgot their first obligation was not only by a testimony to the truth, but actually to be the truth, to live the truth. How then can we arrive at this truth? You know Christ and Christ knows you. And when that happens, you are known by the truth and you're owned by the truth and you live in the truth. You do that by living a Christ-like life. And how do you know that you are possessed by the truth? Well, when you become free of yourself. Free of yourself. There's a simpler way of saying it. Where there is truth, there is the love of God. Where there is the truth, there is the love for God. Where there is the truth, there is God. And God's love will remain in action. That's the truth. So help me God. Amen.